Just when you thought it was safe to process personal data in the UK, the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill is back, or parts of it at least, in the form of the Data Use and Access Bill, or DUAB, which was tabled in the House of Commons yesterday. I'll be looking at the differences between the previous and current attempts to reform the UK's data protection and privacy regime. The EDPB has finished its guidelines on the ePrivacy Directive and brings a lot of new technologies into the scope of the law. And the social media company Pinterest has been hit by a complaint from DUAB with some interesting stuff about data subject rights and the one-stop shop. So I'm Robert Bateman. Thank you as always to Privado AI for their support, and this is the Privacy Corner. First up then, the UK's new Data Use and Access Bill. The UK has had a rocky history with regard to reforming its data protection and privacy framework. There were two versions of the old Data Protection and Digital Information Bill. Neither managed to pass before the last government was kicked out of office in July, and this new version of the new government's data protection reform bill has some striking similarities to the old ones. So firstly, the idea of recognised legitimate interests has survived. These are processing activities deemed legitimate by default, as it were. No need to conduct a balancing test if you want to do these things under legitimate interests. They are fairly obscure for the most part, stuff like safeguarding national security, responding to emergencies, also quite broad in places such as preventing, detecting crime. So those have remained in the bill despite my prediction that they would not. The Information Commissioner's Office is also still set to be reformed, so it will become the Information Commission, and the Commissioner will be part of a board structure with a CEO, a chair, non-exec and exec directors. There are some other changes that have snuck in around whether the ICO has to accept people's complaints and the grounds for rejecting them. Finally, the cookie stuff is still intact. You will, if this bill passes, be able to do some analytics cookies in the UK. The EU rules will still apply in respect of the EU's version of the GDPR, but some statistical processing will be manageable without consent, so on an opt-out basis. The parts of the DPDIB that did not survive include changing the threshold by which controllers can reject a data subject rights requests from manifestly unfounded to vexatious. So this was probably a bit more than just a cosmetic change. The language change was accompanied by some quite helpful stuff about how to recognise vexatious requests. That's all gone now. That won't be part of the new bill. Also, the idea of the senior responsible individual, this was to replace data protection officers. So a member of senior management directly responsible for ensuring GDPR compliance is done, that could delegate their tasks down to someone that may or may not be called a DPO. This idea has now been scrapped. So anyone worried about their job as a data protection officer can breathe a sigh of relief. Then nothing is changing in that regard anymore. So will this bill actually pass? Well, the old one, as I mentioned, didn't, and the second version of it didn't either. This is a new government, stronger majority, better able to get stuff done, 4 years at least until the next election, so probably more likely than the last one to pass, but there were times where I was pretty sure that would pass too, so don't take my word for it. So next up, the European Data Protection Board, or EDPB, has finalised its new guidelines about Article 5.3 of the ePrivacy Directive. These have not changed much since the several-month-long public consultation. As usual, the EDPB has not integrated many stakeholders' feedback into the final guidelines. The idea here is, well, the ePrivacy Directive has been amended several times, but it's still very old. The ePrivacy regulation appears not to be happening. So the EDPB wants to clarify how the law applies to certain new ways of tracking and getting information about people that have emerged since the passing of this law. So the upshot is and we all know this, of course, is not just about cookies. The ePrivacy Directive is about information, and the EDPB is very clear that this is not personal data. It's broader than that. It applies to pretty much any information that could come from a user's terminal equipment, which means device, their phone, computer, laptop, IoT device, and so on. And what we're concerned here is storage or gaining access to information on a person's device. So this includes gaining access to information, can include using a software development kit. This is a slight tweak to the earlier version of the guidelines. So an SDK, if you as an operator instruct an SDK to send information about the user's device or store information on the user's device, that's in scope of the ePrivacy Directive and most likely requires consent unless one of the two limited exceptions applies. So SDKs, be aware of them, whether you're using them, if you're developing SDKs, what they're doing, they do count as a way to access or store information on someone's device. Also, the nature of information is sufficiently broad that it doesn't matter about the source of the information. It might be something the user puts on their device. It might be something the hardware manufacturer embeds into the device. It might come from sensors on the device, so cameras or gyroscopic sensors, those sorts of things. It's all information as far as the EDPB is concerned. They look at some specific use cases, so different ways of gathering information, including pixels, so tiny invisible images that trigger when a user reads an email or visits a web page, customized URLs that might tell operators where their visitors have come from. These constitute gaining access of information on the device. So these are the same as cookies, essentially under the ePrivacy Directive, and will require consent for the same purposes as cookies would. Also, locally processing information on the user's device. So if you're doing all your processing on device and then looking at the output of that processing, that still counts under the ePrivacy Directive. So you might be doing everything client side on an API, an application programming interface. If you're making that information available, then the ePrivacy Directive is triggered. So unless you don't want to, for some reason, read the information, then you need to think about consent. Finally, there have been new attempts to create different types of persistent identifiers over the years, things like hashed email addresses or phone numbers, hashed on the device and then collected and shared subsequently. This still counts as information according to the EDPB. So again, whether it's a cookie or a hashed email address or whatever, the rules still apply. About as broad an interpretation as the EDPB could have given to the ePrivacy Directive, but based on the wording of the law, not unreasonable. I mean, this law is quite old. Many people say it needs an update, and it is worded very strictly. So the EDPB's interpretation is correspondingly strict. Finally, Pinterest is the latest target of NOIB's most recent complaint against their US entity headquartered in California to the French Data Protection Authority, which is interesting, and I will explain why shortly. So this is the usual kind of stuff. I mean, the complainant here alleges that Pinterest was setting cookies by default or using personalized advertising technology by default. All these settings were allegedly on in the platform's privacy center, and NOIB argues that they should have been off and subject to consent, which, if we look at the ePrivacy Directive, as explained in the previous item, that's pretty uncontroversial. Perhaps more interestingly, this complainant made a data subject access request to Pinterest, asking which companies had received personal data about her. And Pinterest got back with a copy of their privacy notice, effectively saying it can share personal data with various of the usual companies like Facebook, Google, Snapchat, etc. Now, this alleged response was not enough for the data subject, who said that the company should have set out exactly which companies they shared her personal data with specifically, and Pinterest came back with something a bit more detailed, saying which companies had been in receipt of this specific user's personal data. But that also was not enough. The user alleged that Pinterest should have linked the types of personal data that it shared about her with the specific companies with which it shared the personal data. So a very detailed level of transparency that NOIB alleges is required here, not an unreasonable one based on previous CJU case law in the Austria Post case, for example, and indeed the EDPB's latest opinion on controllers and processors and sub-processors, the processing chain that I looked at in the last edition of the Privacy Corner. Interestingly as well, NOIB has attempted again to evade the one-stop shop process. So the GDPR says that where you have joint controllers, a data subject can choose which of the joint controllers they complain about. In this case, we've got Pinterest US and Pinterest EU acting as joint controllers. Of course, if the complaint was against Pinterest EU, the complaint would have been rerouted to Ireland, and NOIB is no fan of Ireland. It calls, well, in data protection terms, I'm sure they love the country as a whole, but they call Pinterest's Irish entity, rather uncharitably, a mere post box to avoid taxes and undermine enforcement of EU law. That is NOIB's allegation, rather strongly worded. But if they direct the complaint against the US entity, then that entity is not entitled to the one-stop shop process, and the complaint will go through France, which is much hotter on cookies and that sort of thing, and does not have the tarnished relationship that the Irish DPC has with NOIB. So we'll see if that one works. They're trying lots of different ways to avoid Ireland. Thanks very much. That's all from me this week. Thanks as always to Privado AI for their support, and I'll see you all next time.